All right. So the first section we're going to talk about is just kind of diving into what segregation really means. And I think we spend a lot of time in our schools, trying to portray segregation as simply this like a diversity issue, that a spatial issue that people had to drink from different fountains, had to go to different schools, and that was awful. But we got rid of that. It is a lot of narratives from the '60s bill, but in reality, segregation, yes, it's about spatial and diversity, but the bigger impact of segregation is about equality. It's about equality and resources and economic opportunities and parks and schools and hospitals and all these various different things. Even environmental justice issues, having clean water, having food access issues, things like that. That's really what segregation is about. Is maintaining the best resources for white communities while ensuring that Black, Indigenous communities of color, particularly Black communities, are forced to live in areas that don't have these resources or have worse quality. So this is we talked about this with Flint, Michigan, in the intro, but this is a great example. It's not just about drinking from different fountains. It's about what water access has, and we know this from not only Flint, Michigan, but many poor Black neighborhoods have really awful water. That if that wasn't a lot of people would argue, and myself included, that if those poor Black communities were poor white communities, there would be much more urgency to fix these situations. So that's what segregation. That's what we're going to kind of dive into. So I'll start off by reading Michael Harriot, is a reporter and writer. Wrote this quote: both currently and historically, segregation is best understood as a tool used to promote and preserve white supremacy, deployed to make it easier to isolate, divest from, surveil, and police Black and brown people concentrated in certain communities. So racial segregation, yes, it's about the physical separation of racial groups, but it's also about the separation of access of resources, facilities, services, economic opportunities, access of political power, of wealth, of housing, decent housing, medical care, education, employment, transportation. So it's all the resources that we have in our society. It's about separating them. What John Powell said. Like it's not just about segregation. It's about, I want your segregation, white people are segregated in these opportunities and in these resources while Black people are segregated away from it. And this racial segregation is based on a couple, powerful beliefs that our country was founded on, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these things, especially in the Southern Resistance. We're going to kind of explore, why so many white people were angry. Yes, it had a lot to do with racism, but and at the same time, it had a lot to do with a fear, that they've been, taught, yeah, that Black people were these savage criminals, rapists, all these things, all their life, and they were segregated while they were being taught this, so they didn't see actual Black people that proved these myths wrong. So then all of a sudden, 1964 bill, Lyndon Johnson passes, says, oh, you can't segregate yourself anymore, and there was a lot of fear, a lot of racism, yes, but also a lot of fear, based on racism, based on white supremacy, based on anti-Blackness, that has been pounded into white people in this white supremacy society. A lot of it was this myth, this Black criminality mythology, where that really emerged after the Civil War. We talked a lot about this in different classes, previous classes, but this idea, once Black people were freed and weren't enslaved anymore, the South wanted to continue this white supremacy, so they created this this myth that all these Black people that were freed were prone to being violence, were prone to be rapists, were criminals, and they had to create this racial, criminal justice system, to to protect white people. They had to, suppress the black person's vote to protect white people. They had to, create housing discrimination, to protect white people, or at least that's what they were, pushing and selling. And that was the justification they used to continue white supremacy. That's still being felt today and enforced today. And a big part of all this mythology that was being pushed on people was this idea of the purity of white race. And we talked a lot about this in previous classes as well. But this idea, particularly around like the Christianity, especially in the South, especially during slavery time period, a lot of religion at that time was was modified. It was all the justice and compassion passages were removed from the Bible, and then a lot of Southern Christianity, Baptist, evangelical, all these a lot of these churches that I mean, you couldn't, if you were teaching equality in the South, in your religion, you're kicked out of town or lynched. So really quickly, religion becomes this entity that just supports slavery, and they do this by selling this idea that white Christianity, is basically embodied in white women, in the purity of white women, and the most Christian thing that you could do is to protect the white woman, which also at the same time enforces this awful patriarchal system on women, but also gives white men the justification to enslave black people, to segregate from black people, and to lynch black people, to create racist criminal justice systems, to create laws outlawing the integration of black and white people. So a lot of these myths, that these anti-black myths that were created in order to either preserve slavery or preserve white supremacy after slavery, continue to this is what a lot of white people grew up in, and because they were physically racially segregated from black people, they believed this stuff because they didn't they didn't see it was easy to dehumanize and criminalize black people because they didn't actually have interaction, so they couldn't compare it with what they were being told. So that's how we create this. We're going to dive deeper into a lot of this, but that's how we create these ideas, that these white supremacy ideas and anti-black ideas that push for racial segregation even today. And racial segregation, I have two quotes talking about for today, but basically, so racial segregation, so physical residential segregation, we are making some progress with that. It's very slow progress, but particularly after the 1968, the Fair Housing Act that outlawed a lot of different forms of segregation, and we continue to keep on opposing de facto segregation. We're going to talk a lot more about this in the next class, in the housing discrimination class, but they are making slow improvements. The country is becoming slowly becoming more and more integrated, but at the same time there are lots of pockets, particularly in large metropolitan areas, that remain segregated and don't look like they're going to integrate anytime soon. So yes, we're making some progress, but at the same time that segregation, residential segregation is a very real thing in this country. But then when we turn to school segregation, then that's something we are not making progress anymore. We made a lot of progress, in the 70s and the 80s. It peaked in the 80s, but since the 80s, we'll talk more about this, but due to the lack of, Supreme Court decisions, the lack of government, the white resistance, we have been very fastly resegregating since the 1980s to the point that we're actually more segregated as a society than we were back in the last 50 years, back in the 1960s civil rights bills. So this, sorry, I apologize, this is a long passage, but this is a really great passage that talks about, segregation of opportunity. This is from John Powell, that he was one of the videos in the intro So I'll start out reading. Today, we live with a legacy of deliberate segregated past. Where you live usually determines the school your children attend, your degree of neighborhood safety, your access to public transportation or highways, the availability and quality of finance and credit, your employment opportunities, and your social network. These spatial arrangements of opportunity are contoured by our past, and if not changed, they will have serious implications for our future. The geography of opportunity has significant influence on the choices available to us as on the shape of the culture we inhabit. Unfortunately, in our society, these arrangements continue to carry a footprint of race, whether currently intended or not. We can tell much about someone's life opportunity by his or her zip code. These differences play out not only in our neighborhoods, but also at the city and state levels. At all levels, places with the weakest support for schools, unemployment insurance, and health benefits tend to be geographically and racially concentrated. There is a strong correlation among location, weak economic opportunity, and race. Blacks are generally segregated from opportunity through use of space. Although the majority of poor are white, most of those living in concentrated poverty are Black. In the US, to live in a neighborhood of high concentrated poverty, defined as a percent of the residents below the poverty level, means that life chances for you and your family would be greatly constrained, even if yourself are not poor. Conversely, to live in a neighborhood or state with a solid tax base and good amenities produces a favorable opportunity structure. The life chances of you and your family will be enhanced, even if you are low income. But if you're Black or Latino, even if working or middle class, you are much more likely to live in a neighborhood or state with a weak opportunity structure than you would be if you were white. A myriad of public policies and private practices create these spatial opportunity structures and sort people into them. Lives in where Black lives in large numbers, whether in particular state or region or rural or urban area within a region, those places tend to be underfunded with weak institutions. Even if someone from one of those stressed areas can get a job site, there is growing evidence that he or she will face discrimination, not just based on race, but also based on places or zip codes where Blacks are most likely to live. Factors such as poor schools, crime, or low fiscal base, a weak job opportunity, and inadequate social network tend to reinforce each other. A family living in this environment must overcome cumulative factors that expose its members to mutually reinforcing constraints. The interaction of different conditions in the environment cannot be explained by just focusing on individuals. Looking at systems, you can understand that causation is multiple, mutual, cumulative, and reciprocal, and the relationships among different factors are just as important as factors themselves. For example, poor schools, limited employment options, and limited employment options for parents mean that their children are more likely to wind up in poor schools. So outcomes are not caused by a particular input, schools, but are produced by reciprocal interactions of various inputs, schools, neighborhoods, jobs, and crime. 5 decades of social science research have documented the relationship between racially and economically isolated neighborhoods, employment, health, crime, and violence, educational opportunities, and a range of other factors. A systems approach brings into their view ways in which outcomes produced within the system spill across societal settings, accumulating across institutional domains and existing economic and racial segregation that is now embedded in many of our metropolitan regions. Housing locations, for example, is one of the primary mechanisms for accessing opportunity in our society. Spatial segregation is opportunity segregation. Americans should not have been surprised or confused as to why so many of the families stranded in New Orleans just happen to be Black. All right, so I know that was long, and I apologize, but this is just perfect summary of not only like a lot of policies that create these racial segregation, but how it's a systemic thing. It's not just like, oh, that school, that neighborhood doesn't have a good school. That's what's causing it. Is that neighborhood doesn't have a good school. That neighborhood is been underfunded, disinvested, lacks economic opportunity, which causes more crime, and all these different things is missing, healthcare, banking, things like that, and that creates this reciprocal thing where it's very hard to get, to escape that concentration, poverty concentrated. All right. So Urban Wire, they did a really great article they kind of dive a little bit deeper into like the lingering costs of segregation and discrimination. They found a typical white person lives in a neighborhood that is 75% white and 8% black, as opposed to a black person who lives in a neighborhood that's 35% white and 45% black. As John Powell talks about, like white people are the most segregated people, as opposed to communities of color typically are more diverse. And segregation, housing discrimination leads to concentration of poverty. So today, compared to a low-income white person, a low-income black person is 3 times more likely to live in very high concentrated poverty, and 2 times for a Latinx person. So that means, that a lot of this, a lot of people will argue, well, which is more, economic um, or racial, which one has bigger impact. But when you look at, even, poor white people are more likely to live in better off white communities, as opposed to, well off black people are still more likely to be, found in poor black communities. And we're going to talk a lot more about that throughout this presentation as well. But one of the more important things is, we talked a lot about this in the last quote: segregation, housing discrimination perpetuates inequality and injustice. So it's, segregation is what perpetuates this continuing, particularly with concentrated poverty, because you're living in poverty. There's a famous quote, James Baldwin says, anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows this, how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And I've heard a lot of people kind of laugh at that, because they don't realize just how true that really is. Like when you're living in poverty, how hard that is to escape, when you don't have good economic opportunities, don't have good educational opportunities, don't have, good healthcare and banking opportunities, and that just perpetuates that poverty. And the last part, the Urban Wire, made was that this isn't just hurting black people. So white people can't be like, ooh, I'm fine, because in reality, I mean, these are millions of people that could, that we're forcing to live in this poverty, who could be, effective, could be beneficial, workers and businesses and things, contributing to our economy, contributing to our tax base, building up our economy in our country. But instead, they're forced to live in poverty. They're forced, which causes a lot of outcomes that all of us are are paying for as well. So this isn't just like, oh, I'm fine. Black people are the ones hurting. This is that this is something that all the entire country is hurting the entire country by keeping people of color in concentrated poverty. So Mark Treskin writes, more inclusive or less segregated regions have higher average incomes and educational attainments and lower homicide rates. So I wanted to play a real quick video. Bernie Sanders just kind of gives us some examples of how expensive it is to be poor.
Maybe one more question. Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. Take a walk around this community. Now, my wife Jane and I live in Burlington, Vermont. A few blocks away from where we live, there's a very nice grocery store, supermarket. We buy good quality food, produce at a reasonable price. You don't have that here. So the prices that people in this community are paying are substantially higher than what I pay, and the quality of the food that I get is significantly better. I put my money into a bank. I get some interest rates. If I have to cash a check, I'm not paying 15, 20, or 50%, or whatever the interest rates may be, to cash a check because I have a bank. I didn't notice too many local branch banks in this community because I guess there aren't any. Okay? I can own a home. And at the end of the day, you gain wealth when you own a home and you don't have to rent. So the truth of the matter is that the interest rates the poor people pay are often higher. They're paying rent rather than living in their own homes, not to mention that the jobs that they're working in, by definition, are paying wages that are often inadequate to take care of their families. So being poor is, in fact, a very expensive proposition. Okay, thank you all very much.
All right, and that was just just a few examples of what it really means to be in living in concentrated poverty. And again, a lot of people will say, well, everyone there are white people living in poverty too. And yes, I mean, not to downplay what they're dealing with, but to go back to the urban wire, the majority of people living in concentration of poverty are going to be, Black people, or people, Black Indigenous people of color. And even though there are more poor white people, oftentimes they live in communities that aren't concentrating their poverty. They're more spread out. They're living closer to middle class and upper class white people. And they're part of their tax basis, so they're part of their schools, as opposed to typically on average more Black people are focused and are pushed into these areas that don't have that. They're not getting that rich white neighborhood tax base as well. They're more concentrated into this poverty and pushed into these little areas, and due to our history, this is due to a history of housing discrimination and racial segregation that's still being perpetuated today. All right, so I want to talk just real briefly about some outcomes of racial segregation. So Nicole Hannah Jones and from writes, more than 20 years of research has implicated racial segregation in virtually every aspect of racial inequality, from higher unemployment rates for African Americans to poor healthcare to elevated infant mortality rates, and most of all to inferior schools. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Hopefully, at this point, this is, people are getting the idea of what it means to not only have racial segregation, but to force the people on the bottom of that racial hierarchy to segregate them into concentrated poverty. But we're looking at separate unequal access to schools, housing, hospitals, concentrations of poverty, increased targeting of systemic racism, whether that's, used to be redlining, and now it's like reverse redlining, trying to, push bad loans on Black people, gentrification, police brutality, broken windows policies, all these things, targeting and surveillance. We see this, happening more in Black communities. Investments and divestments. I mean, communities close. A lot of these, a lot of the economic investments and opportunities, you'll find more in white communities versus Black communities. Not only like public-private investments, but also even like how houses in Black communities are valued by banks. Homes in Black neighborhoods are valued on average 48,000 less than white neighborhood homes, and that's like same homes with the same conditions. If they're in the Black community, the banks is going to value them less, even if that community has the same crime level, same whatever, same schools. They're still going to be valued less. I saw a study that amounts that devaluing of Black home ownership amounts to $150 billion. And in addition to that, we have the education, majority, a huge portion of property value of schools funding actually comes from property value. So you have a rich neighborhood, rich school, poor neighborhood, poor school. And that really equates to, there was a recent study came out last year that found that, white majority schools receive $23 billion a year more in educational funding than non-white schools. And that breaks down to, on average, that breaks down to a white student will have, $2,600 per student more than the non-white student. And I've seen that, number go, up to like as far as like 10, 15,000. I mean, there's some, white neighborhood districts that are, the kids are receiving more than 10,000 a year, per student. So that's the compared to very poor Black schools. And and that's the thing about Brown versus Board education is all, I mean, about public schools are supposed to all be equal. This is supposed to be the great equalizer of our nation is our public schools. And in fact, it's just another tool for white supremacy, in many cases. Yeah. And then again, and then looking at the white perspective, a majority of white people, I mean, there was a study out there, it was like a simple majority, but it was like, 51% of white people surveyed in this huge survey, thought that, white people were discriminated against just as much, if not more than Black people. And I gotta give, to think that in this country, I mean, it's just the only way that's possible is to really segregate people. And that's true. I mean, and that's one of the impacts of segregating these white communities who happen to have all the funding, have majority of funds in this country and the majority of political power is you create you continue these anti-black myths. You continue the fact, this like fear and criminalizing and demonizing black people, you continue, racial bias that appears in employments and banking and schools. You continue all these different, things, these, anti-black, things, these racial hierarchies, because black people, white people just, they don't know, they don't, majority of white people don't actually have black people in their friends groups, black people in their social networks, or if they do, they don't, have that kind of relationship that where a black person can actually be honest with them. So they're not receiving any of the, that perspective, and instead they're just, the white perspective of oftentimes, politicians can wield that, creating that white victimhood, and that, that's why we see all this opposition to these, like, programs of racial equality, such as affirmative action and things like that. Because yeah, and that is something, I mean, we talked about a lot already on all of our past classes, but racial segregation is a big part of kind of continuing these personal experiences and stereotypes and interactions that perpetuate white supremacy. And ultimately, the outcomes of racial segregation, we have huge inequalities in wealth and healthcare and education and employment. And at the same time, we're perpetuating these racist systems, such as mass incarceration, school to prison pipelines, racial stereotypes, environmental racism. All these things are that are continuing from racial segregation. So I really like this bottom quote from Jon Stewart. This came out during the George Floyd protest. But he said, "The police are a reflection of society. They're not a rogue alien organization that came down to torment the Black community. They're enforcing segregation. Segregation is legally over, but it never ended. The police are in some respects a border patrol, and they patrol the border between the two Americas." And then, to kind of go back to John Powell, segregation is segregation opportunity. The police are, patrolling. They're the border patrol, ultimately between opportunity, between resources, between, good and bad schools, good and bad, hospitals, good and bad, communities, or invested and invested communities. So I want to highlight the big part, because we're going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about school segregation, because that, again, I mean, like I said, public schools are supposed to be the the great equalizer. They're supposed to, be a place where any kid, no matter where they come from, their opportunity, their past experiences, can get the same equal opportunity in education. But unfortunately, that is really not happening to this day, and that has to do a lot with school funding. If you look at this chart, that it outlines that on average the typical funding process for most schools, and yes, there is some federal funding that tries to make up, for differences sometimes, but also enforces, like from No Child Left Behind, the federal funding that was actually used to enforce, a lot of bad things. And then you have the state that's offering much, but then local, some of that is evenly distributed, but then you have this huge percentage, the third, we're talking billions and billions of dollars in this 36%, that is basically property tax. So you have a rich neighborhood, rich school, poor neighborhood, poor school, and we see that, and that is one of the reasons why we fight so hard to preserve, white people fight so hard to preserve school segregation. Clara Lombardo, wrote, in Arizona, poor primary white school districts get about 19,000 per student, while high poverty non-white districts get about 8,000, according to EdBuild. EdBuild is a education research center. That means high poverty districts made up of mostly students of color, about a third of the school districts in the state receive almost 11,000 less per student than the state's high poverty, predominantly white schools. All right, sorry, I swear I don't have too many of these long passages, but I just want to read another one by Michael Harriot. about this talks a little bit about how we got to this point, where that 23 billion was a reality. And he wrote this really great passage that summed up better than I probably could. So I'm just going to read this passage. Apologies again. One of the least discussed aspects of public education is how school funding is tied to the history of segregation and Jim Crow. When state and federal governments distribute money equally, Black schools still end up at the funding disadvantage. If you're wondering why the economics of school funding is framed as Black versus white instead of rich versus poor, the reason is simple. The National Center for Educational Statistics reports that 3/4 Black high school students attend schools where most of their classmates are poor, citing the statistic as the #1 indicator of an inferior school. According to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, about 36% of education funding comes from local property taxes. This means that schools in white school districts can allocate more money to education than schools in majority Black districts. 80 years ago, the government practice of redlining, fueled by segregation laws, determined that it was risky for banks to offer mortgages in the areas where Black people live. Today, 41% of African American homeowners own property in Black neighborhoods, and according to research by the National Association of Home Builders, home ownership is the primary driver of wealth in the U.S., accounting for 25% of the average American total assets. Redlining's longest lasting effect in this vast majority of homes in formerly redlined neighborhoods are undervalued. A recent study by the Brookings Institute showed that homes in Black neighborhoods on average value 25% lower than homes in white neighborhoods, even if the homes have similar characteristics and the neighborhoods have similar amenities, crime rates, and resources. In fact, the average home in Black neighborhood is devalued by 48,000 simply because Black people live in the area, leading to a massive 156 billion decrease in property values. If one's most important asset is devalued simply because it exists in a Black neighborhood, it is no mystery why Black neighborhoods are poorer. Because homes in Black neighborhoods are systemically undervalued, and because home values are the most determinant in school funding in Black neighborhoods can't be equal. This is why, according to the 2019 study by Ed Bell, schools serving non-white students received 23 billion less in funding than majority white schools, despite serving the same number of students. It's why the average non-white school district receives $2,226 less than student with a white school district. It's also why Black schools offer fewer advanced placements, STEM, and honor courses. About 1/4 of majority minority high schools don't even offer a second year algebra. According to the educational department, even those 2 years of algebra are usually required to even apply for college. And even when Black students attend majority white schools, they are still not recommended for college level courses, are disciplined more harshly, suspended more frequently, and feared by white teachers. It is undeniable, statistically proven fact. White students get a better education. It has to do less with income than color. Educators and academic circles have come up with this name, white supremacy. All right. So I really want, like in next class, we're going to dive into the history of housing discrimination and redlining in particular. Redlining came from, the New Deal, FDR. He wanted to, the Federal Housing Association wanted to start, building wealth, in America through home ownership, but at the same time they had to appeal to Dixiecrats and Southern, very racist politicians. So they created this idea that they would, they turned to the private realtors who, government wasn't at the time wasn't allowed to discriminate racially, but private realtors were. So they created these risk assessment maps, with different colors, and the red being the worst, and all Black communities, regardless of their risk, were put into the red area, meaning that they would be denied home loans. And that's between, the Federal Housing Association, which created billions of dollars of loans and grants for homes, but that started I think like 1934 35, something around there, between that up until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that outlawed redlining. 98% of home loans went to white people, so enormous amount of wealth, home ownership, and was created, and racial segregation. I think really I mean, I know we talk a lot about the New Deal, and the New Deal did, in our schools, and it did do a lot of great things, but we always leave out the fact that it also, those great things were mainly for white people, and what it did for the rest of the country was create a pretty solid structure of racial inequality and racial segregation, and that, and the outcomes of that is what we're seeing today in our school systems. And it's not just, it's not just K through 12 schools as well. At the same time, it's also Black colleges are experiencing the same exact, and it's important. Black colleges are super important because Black people do not get the same access and representation in normal colleges or white colleges. So majority of historically Black colleges and universities, we call them HBCU. A lot of them were funded right after the Civil War, when people, when we realized that, oh, yes, all these, Black people were free, but none of them could, get into these colleges because the colleges were still run by very racist missions. So that's when, that's when we start seeing this emergence of these new Black colleges that helped, Black people, gave them the opportunity to actually get a higher education when they were being denied through the white colleges. And so we see that, so we have these Black colleges, and we have PWI, which I believe is primarily white institutions, or something like that. You Google that, PWIs, what we refer to colleges that are mainly white. Even though, I mean, legally they can't discriminate, but they still find lots of other ways, to ensure. Like if you look down, even with affirmative action, and affirmative action is important to understand. Affirmative action isn't giving unqualified people an opportunity; it's giving qualified Black people and Black, indigenous people, color people, a chance to actually get into these schools. So and a lot of times white people will demonize this program by saying it's giving Black people, unqualified people, opportunities, and that's not what it does. It gives qualified people a chance to actually attend institutions that have racist barriers to keep them out. But even with affirmative action, the majority of people that attend these schools just disproportionately are white. A lot of this has to do with the legacy. A lot of these schools, like Ivy League schools, have these legacy programs where if your parents went there, you have a better chance of getting in than anyone else. They reserve a certain a huge portion of the population for legacies. And if we happen to live in a very racist country, a very racist history, so more white people are more likely to be legacies. But even as we look at Black students make up 8% of students at Ivy League and other really highly selective colleges and universities. And if you look at 15% of high school graduates are Black, and 13% of the population is Black. So that's having only 8% representation. There's something going on. There's still a lot of issues. And even when you look at these admissions, you look at the fact that they rely heavily on test scores. We'll talk about test scores, but test scores from the beginning were created as a way to racially segregate people and benefit white people. But even all that, I'm saying is just that we do have a very, very racially segregated college systems. So that's one of the importance of historically Black colleges. But if you look at the endowments that were created to help finance and fund these institutions, I mean, you look at the top 5 endowments. Harvard, I mean, they're all in the billions, tens of billions of dollars. And then you look at the top 5, historically Black colleges, and these, anyone can still apply to these schools. They just, again, it's like affirmative action. They just remove the barriers from, so Black people qualified Black people can actually have a chance to get in these schools. And you look at their endowments, and it's like, it's nothing compared to these billions. It doesn't even come close to 1 billion. And you can see, if you live in Maryland, or close, if you live in DC, we see this playing out. There was actually this lawsuit that's been going on for decades, because Maryland was a big one that significantly underfunded their Black schools, significantly, and did a lot of other things, like try to mimic their programming at white schools, so they can, try to, they found clever ways to try to decrease the student population of these schools as well. So, federal judges actually found Maryland guilty of creating a segregation system in their colleges, and they've been trying to do a settlement. Last year, they were going to give $500 million to these Black schools. And then, the Maryland government, passed it and everything, and then Larry Hogan, the governor, vetoed it, and so they're kind of going back to square one. They're trying to figure out how to keep it going, but that's just one example of what happened throughout the entire country. So I'm going to read from Andre Perry writes, from 1970 to 1997, there were court cases mandating equitable funding at public HBCUs in more than a dozen states. Court action has forced some states to address funding disparities, but in at least a half of states, fewer dollars are still being allocated to HBCUs than predominantly white institutions, also known as PWIs, predominantly white institutions. The more than 100 HBCUs receive significantly less state and federal dollars than their white peers. For example, in 2008, students at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and North Carolina State receives $15,700 each, while the state allocated the HBCUs, North Carolina AT and Fayetteville State, $7,800 per student. So although colleges, this probably has less to do with residential segregation, this still has a lot to do with school segregation. So that's why I included this as well. So just wanted to show that it's not just happening on a K through 12. It's happening at all forms of colleges. All right, so I'm going to end this section with a presentation by Nicole Hannah-Jones. She did this in 2019. She did a presentation on it was an MLK Humanities Forum. I think it was like Rhode Island or something like that, where it was, or I think it's actually, this is the district that you can't. It was a bad recording. You can't really see the presentations, but really, it's more about what she's saying that I want people, get. But yeah, I'm going to play this clip about. She's going to give a little bit more of the history of desegregation, and then we're going to jump into our next section is going to be about kind of diving into segregation.
We tend to think of Brown being about separate and unequal. That Brown addresses the unequal conditions in schools for Black children, and so that Brown requires equality of resources. But Brown doesn't actually deal with that really at all. Brown is about citizenship. Because, see, the South had started to understand that the vast disparity between Black and white schools was going to bite them in the ass. They were starting to lose federal lawsuits about the unequal conditions of Black schools. So Southern states had began pumping a lot of money into Black schools in a quick attempt to try to equalize those schools to avoid a larger ruling on school desegregation. What Brown says is that if all of the tangibles and intangibles are the same, if Black kids have the same textbooks, same facilities, same teachers, is segregation still unconstitutional? And it says we believe that it is. Because in a country built on racial caste, that segregation is designed to demean Black students. And it is designed to deny full democracy to Black people. And so therefore, segregation is inherently unequal. It cannot be made equal. When you understand that, then you realize that all of these other reforms we've had that basically are just trying to make segregated schools equal are not actually complying with the spirit of Brown. And we can look at these pictures, the picture on your left, that's Linda Brown sitting in this first seat here, the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, before they won the lawsuit. And we all know that that picture is wrong. But somehow we look at this picture on the right and we're okay with that. Because we say the law no longer requires it, even though these children and their families are not choosing this segregation. And this is a national scourge. The picture there on the left is in the Bronx, and the picture on the right is in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I could add more slides that show schools that are 100% Latino and poor, and often Black and Latino kids are now segregated in schools together. And they're segregated in the lowest resource schools and the highest poverty schools. So when the Supreme Court rules that separate is inherently unequal, what it is recognizing is that when you have a country that has to so demean a race of people that you can trade them and barter them like real estate. That separating those children in their own schools means you will never treat those children like your own. That you will never ensure equality in those schools. And that also you are separating those children from those who have the power in our society. Who runs our institutions? Who runs our government? Who runs this college? Who's in the DA's office or the mayor's office? So when you're separating Black and brown children in their own schools, you're not just separating them from access to an equal education, you're also separating them from power. And simply giving those kids a quality teacher doesn't change that. But we don't even give those kids a quality teacher. Because the research on this is very clear. Segregated schools actually exacerbate inequality. Instead of working to close the gap, the longer a Black child stays in a segregated school, the further he or she falls behind. If they enter schools 3 years behind, by the time they graduate, they're 6. These schools are not helping our kids reach equality. They're actually ensuring that many of our kids will not. And it's not hard to figure out why. If you go to the US Department of Education, they have a civil rights data collection. And what you will find is you plug in any city in the country, and if there's a Black school and a white school, that Black school always has less. I give dozens of speeches every year. In every community I go in, I challenge anyone to show me the one community where this is not true. Where you can go to the Black school and it has the same things and no one has proved me wrong. I'm dying for someone to prove me wrong because I want to study the hell out of this place that has managed to do what no other place has done. We can to this day predict the quality of an education children will receive by the color of the skin of the kids in that school. Everything from access to advanced placement classes to whether they have experienced and certified teachers, whether their facilities are up to date, whether they have access to technology. That is not changed. That is the design of the system. So I think I always say this during my speeches. I always hate that I have to say this during my speeches. There's nothing about white kids that makes Black kids smart. Y'all don't rub off smart dust on Black kids. What having Black kids in the same classroom with white kids does is ensure that Black kids get the type of education we ensure white children get. And it's not to say there are not white children who are poorly educated, because God knows there are. But what it is to say is if there's Black kids in that town, they're worse. That's racial caste. That you can make that prediction and that probably there's no one in this room who's surprised by that. That the assumption is, of course, Black kids will not have the same education as white kids. That is racial caste. That is what our segregated schools maintain, and that is what integrated schools break up. So what are the natural outcomes of understanding that Black and brown kids are placed into inferior schools? It is not surprising that we have a huge racial achievement gap in every city in the country. It's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. Because the only way you believe it's an achievement gap is if you believe that Black children are intellectually inferior, and we know that they are not given the same opportunities to learn. We are at an institution of higher learning, so how does this separate but unequal system then play out? When it is time to apply for colleges, we all want to pretend that we have a meritocracy. Despite all of the facts on the ground, outline how Black and brown children are receiving an inferior K-12 education. When it comes time to apply for college, Lord knows if you have an affirmative action policy, people think that's unfair. Because we want to pretend that we all have an equal shot of getting the same scores on our ACT, and we all went to the same types of high schools, we all had the same access to AP courses, when we know that that's not true. Affirmative action is about trying to right racial wrongs and trying to adjust for inequality. It is not about letting unqualified, undeserving students in over students who worked hard or not. Yet even with affirmative action, Black and Latino kids are still vastly underrepresented at the top colleges in this country. So despite this belief that Black kids are taking everybody's seats, they're actually not. White people are doing quite well. The share of Black freshmen at elite high schools has actually remained unchanged since 1980. 40 years, we have seen no increase in the percentage of Black kids at elite schools. Then if we look at Providence College, we see that Black and Latino and Native American students are vastly underrepresented here. Now, I went to a Catholic university. I know how important, at least, the idea of social justice is at Catholic universities, though my experience didn't necessarily bear that out. I feel like this is an area that the college should be ashamed of. That a college located in a city like this should at least be able to match the demographics of the state. And that there's much more work to be done, because you can't, on the one hand, acknowledge the grave inequality that Black and Latino children face, and then somehow not acknowledge that when you're figuring out how to let people into your schools. Because when I talk about integration, I know we've become obsessed with test scores. And somehow we think the only thing that matters in a school is test scores. I can promise you, test scores, they measure some things, mostly what type of privilege you grew up in your household, or how well you take a test, or what type of knowledge you've gained in certain areas of life. But test scores really aren't about anything. And when you go to college, really no one cares what you got on your ninth grade test. School segregation actually solidifies racial caste, and that is why integration matters. Yes, it's important to close achievement gaps, but achievement gaps are not the biggest problem with integration and segregation. What the longitudinal data shows is that integrated schools for Black children actually changes the entire trajectories of their lives. That being able to attend an integrated quality school means that Black people are able to break racial caste. What the data shows is those children are much more likely to graduate from college, they're less likely to go to jail, they're less likely to be poor, they're less likely to live in segregated neighborhoods. Now, there are exceptional all-Black schools, and there's nothing inherently wrong with an all-Black school. It's just that in this country, in a country based on racial apartheid, all-Black schools have never tended to get the same amount of resources. So we have a lot of reasons and excuses why we can't pursue integration. Politically, it's not possible. It's really hard to ride a bus. Except when the neighborhood is white and the schools are Black, I see white parents putting their kids on buses all the time, as long as the buses are getting them away from their neighborhood schools. I live in New York City, where parents will put their kids on the train for an hour to get them into the right school. So what we really have is a lack of will. What we really have is a fear of Black children that we need to confront. Because if we say we believe in educational equality, and there's only one reform that's ever worked on scale, it's not charter schools, it's not No Child Left Behind, it's not Race to the Top, it's not vouchers. There's been one thing that's worked on scale, and that's school integration. Then we have to ask ourselves, why is that the one thing that's always off the table, no matter what? That is the non-starter. Because the inequality is not accidental, which means we choose it. We make a choice. So we can either choose to sustain it, or we can choose to undo it.
All right. Apologies. I had mixed up this video with another one. The next section, we'll see, she's going to go over the same speech, but she's going to go over kind of the history of desegregation. But this one's more focused just on the cost of segregation. And again, I know we keep on talking about this general theme, but I really like this quote down here. There's nothing about white kids that make Black kids smarter. What having Black kids in the same class room as white kids does is ensure Black kids get the type of education we ensure white kids get. So this is what school segregation or integration is about. It's, like she said, there's nothing wrong with Black schools, majority Black schools. There's nothing wrong with in itself. It's how they're funded, the access of power that is mainly reserved in this country for white schools. So by integrating, we're I think it's really good. I mean, she's mentioned like the only program that's ever worked to ensure equal education on a large scale is school integration. But yeah, we don't, we avoid that, and particularly since the 80s and 70s and 80s with the white resistant movements. and we try to do all kinds of other things, charter schools, magnet schools, vouchers, all this other stuff that just is continuing this idea of separate but equal, which we know is a myth. Yeah. But yeah.